Can a single drop of rain be an expression of God's love for the wicked, or is it merely a tool designed to seal their ultimate condemnation? In the autumn of 1924, this seemingly abstract question did not just occupy ivory tower minds, it ignited an ecclesiastical wildfire through Midwestern immigrant communities. These precise theological deliberations carry profound institutional and existential consequences, standing out historically within the Christian Reformed Church as a defining moment of dogmatic crystallization. The core of this fracturing lay in the official adoption of common grace, a framework explaining the relationship between God, his chosen people, and the unregenerate world. What began as an effort to articulate divine interaction triggered a permanent structural divide, culminating in the sudden expulsion of several defiant dissenting ministers. This structural divide ultimately led to the subsequent historic formation of the Protestant Reformed Churches. Permanently separating these passionate believers from their original denomination, today we thoroughly investigate the complex dogmatic developments, intense institutional realities, and deeply held convictions that transformed a disagreement over divine favor into separation. The 1924 division within the Christian Reformed Church was driven by the formal adoption of neo-Calvinist common grace theology, heavily influenced by the prominent Dutch theologian Abraham Kuyper. Seeking to standardize its stance on how God interacts with non-believers, the CRC Synod of 1924 codified the 3 points, transforming fierce internal debate into a binding denominational standard. The first point established that God maintains a favorable non-saving attitude toward all creation, not just the elect, manifested through temporal blessings like rain and sunshine. The second point declared that God providentially intervenes in human hearts and society to actively restrain the full, destructive expression of mankind's inherent total depravity. The third point argued that unregenerate humans, though incapable of saving good, can still perform civil good, making valuable secular contributions to art, science, and governance. This dogmatic formulation was originally sparked by the controversial Jansen case, where a seminary professor defended higher critical biblical analysis by appealing to common grace. In its effort to stabilize the denomination, the Synod significantly deviated from Kuyper's original boundaries, shifting the doctrine from a providential operation to an underlying attitude of favor. By affirming a favorable divine attitude toward the reprobate, the CRC created a deep theological rift, with critics arguing the move compromised the particularity of sovereign grace. The formal adoption of common grace encountered immediate resistance from a pastoral faction led by Herman Hoeksema, Henry Danhoff, and George Ophoff, who rigorously defended traditional Reformed confessionalism. Concerning particular grace, Hoeksema contended that divine favor is strictly an expression of God's saving love toward the elect, arguing a universal inclination creates a dualism in the divine will. Defending total depravity, critics argued that affirming a non-believer's capacity for civic righteousness effectively nullified depravity, compromising the vital necessity of supernatural regeneration for dead sinners. Regarding the reprobate, Hoeksema asserted God's attitude is characterized exclusively by holy wrath, meaning temporal gifts are not tokens of favor, but solemn means of final condemnation. This divide directly impacted evangelism and preaching, as the fierce opposition firmly rejected the free offer, denying that preaching includes a well-meant, gracious invitation to save every hearer. Hoeksema argued this framework made efficacy dependent upon human will, maintaining instead that preaching is a double-edged instrument, a promise to the elect and judgment hardening the reprobate. Hoeksema strongly warned that adopting common grace would cause an inevitable, catastrophic slide toward Arminianism regarding divine grace and Pelagianism regarding fallen human ability. By creating a category of divine favor completely separate from Christ's cross, he argued the CRC deeply eroded orthodox boundaries and severely compromised the unadulterated preaching of sovereign grace. Herman Hoeksema initially led the offensive that successfully secured the dismissal of Professor Ralph Jansen, but he quickly continued his campaign targeting the doctrine of common grace itself. This persistent agitation forced the leadership's hand. At the Synod of 1924, the denomination officially ratified the 3 points of common grace, transforming open debate into binding law. When Hoeksema and his supportive consistories firmly refused to sign the documents or remain silent, the local classis suspended him and abruptly deposed his consistory for insubordination. These sudden separations were executed with notable haste, systematically prioritizing strict administrative conformity over any deep, meaningful theological exploration or careful pastoral deliberation regarding the split. Beneath the intense doctrinal debate lay deep personal grudges from the Janssen trials, actively fueling political factions who were eager for swift institutional retribution against the dissenters. The classis took the highly unusual step of deposing entire local consistories to completely isolate the dissenting pastors, cutting off their immediate institutional support within the denomination. Critics fiercely argued this extreme action directly violated local church autonomy under the historic church order of Dort, defending the traditional structural rights of the individual congregation. This aggressive process ultimately led modern historians to view the entire ouster as politically vindictive and structurally flawed, rather than a purely spiritual exercise of church discipline. The expulsion of Hoeksema and his colleagues did not dissolve their movement. Instead, it accelerated the creation of a distinct ecclesiastical identity as they sought to preserve their heritage. From 1924 to 1925, they operated under a temporary name, signaling that they viewed themselves not as schismatics, but as the true, faithful continuum of the CRC. By 1926, recognizing reconciliation was completely impossible, they formally organized as the Protestant Reformed Churches, firmly anchoring their new identity upon the traditional 3 forms of unity. To ensure long-term self-sufficiency, the young denomination rapidly built its own infrastructure, establishing a theological seminary, launching missionary endeavors, and organizing parent-controlled Christian day schools. Additionally, the Reformed Free Publishing Association was officially founded to produce the Standard Bearer, a theological journal serving as the absolute primary voice for their convictions. The PRC's intellectual weight derived overwhelmingly from Hoeksema. A highly capable systematician, he carved out the definitive boundaries separating the PRC from the broader Reformed world. Through his comprehensive Reformed dogmatics, Hoeksema constructed a strict particularist theological system that systematically and completely excised any notion of common or universal divine favor. His most monumental pastoral achievement was the Triple Knowledge, a multi-volume work arguing that God's covenant is an unconditional fellowship intended exclusively for the elect. The most severe internal test occurred in the early 1950s over whether God's covenant relationship operates conditionally or unconditionally, sparking intense debate across the young denomination. The tension exploded when Hubert de Wolf argued that faith acts as a prerequisite condition to experience salvation, a phrasing that Hoeksema fiercely condemned as an Arminian trend. This sharp deadlock prompted a massive schism that cut the young denomination completely in half, causing many of the departing congregations to eventually return to the CRC. Following the 1953 crisis, the PRC stabilized. By the late 20th century, the denomination maintained 27 stable congregations and roughly 7,000 dedicated members across North America. Despite its small North American size, the PRC rapidly developed a global footprint, establishing active missions, training centers, and vital sister church relationships across several distant continents. Historians often categorize the PRC as North America's primary hyper-Calvinist body, which remains a highly unique and rare designation for a theological tradition that actively practices infant baptism. Their defining characteristic remains the absolute rejection of any divine favor toward the reprobate, completely separating them from mainstream Calvinist frameworks regarding the nature of grace. While mainstream Calvinists view temporal blessings like rain as signs of common grace, The PRC interprets them as instruments, leaving the unredeemed completely without any valid excuse. Decades after the 1924 schism, polarizing emotions have given way to objective evaluations as modern scholars recognize the complex intersection of doctrine, pressure, and mechanics. Contemporary historians generally validate the legitimacy of Hoeksema's initial concerns, noting he correctly discerned how common grace could be weaponized to erode the boundaries of orthodoxy. By creating a neutral zone for cultural cooperation, the CRC risked inviting secularizing influences into its institutions, a danger scholars acknowledge Hoeksema was entirely right to challenge. The failure of 1924 stemmed from a toxic all-or-nothing framework, transforming a complex disagreement among confessional brothers into a rigid test of institutional loyalty. Leaders carrying grudges from the Janssen trials seized the debate to settle administrative scores, replacing pastoral deliberation with an aggressive exercise of authority designed to purge dissent. Because Hoeksema framed the CRC's position as a catastrophic heresy, compromise was impossible, relying heavily on logic arguing that universal favor inevitably leads to Arminianism. The legacy of 1924 stands as a sobering monument to how the pursuit of dogmatic purity, paired with institutional politics, permanently fractures a church community. The common grace controversy of 1924 stands as a profound case study in the dynamics of confessional development and ecclesiastical division within the historic Reformed tradition. What began as an effort to navigate the boundaries of cultural engagement ultimately exposed a deep disagreement over the nature of grace, catalyzing a permanent structural separation. Through the unyielding leadership and extensive theological output of Herman Hoeksema, the PRC forged a highly distinct identity rooted in absolute particularism. This new denomination firmly anchored its identity upon a strict defense of human total depravity and an absolute rejection of any universal divine favor. While subsequent internal crises, such as the conditional covenant split of 1953, deeply tested the survival of the young denomination, the PRC stubbornly maintained its commitment. Through this deep commitment to its foundational principles, the small body established a highly resilient global footprint that extended far beyond its North American borders. Ultimately, the historiographical legacy of the 1924 split reveals the intricate interplay between core doctrine, strong personality, and complex institutional politics. The narrative of the CRC and PRC split remains an enduring reminder of the immense weight of theological conviction, where definitions of divine favor continue to shape history. The fracturing of 1924 compels us to look beyond historical timelines and examine the underlying mechanics of our own theological frameworks. It challenges believers to consider how deeply held convictions can be maintained without sacrificing ecclesiastical unity, or conversely, when compromise becomes a betrayal of truth. As you reflect on this schism, ask yourself, if human logic is applied rigidly to the infinite mysteries of divine grace, do we inevitably create an idol of our own systemization? Furthermore, does our contemporary pursuit of cultural engagement inadvertently dull the sharp, necessary edge of orthodox distinctiveness? The quest for theological purity and the pressures of cultural adaptation did not end in the mid-20th century. Join us next week as we fast forward to a different era and dive deep into the bitter 1990 split over female ordination, exploring the systemic institutional shifts that drew a sharp line between the CRC and the URCNA. If you appreciate rigorous, objective historical analysis that unpacks the why and how behind church history's most critical turning points, make sure you never miss an episode. Subscribe to Theology today, right now, to stay connected with our growing community of modern theologians, thinkers, and historians.